Welcome to American Spirits episode. What episode is it? Episode 20. And today we are joined by Ryan Turnipseed as usual, the co host. How are you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing, Charlie?
Uh, Apparently shorting out electrical cables, but everything's fine. Um, and now we're also joined today by George Bagby. Thank you very much for coming on. I know people are going to be excited to have you as a guest, so welcome. How are you doing?
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
Cool. And I just noticed, I need to go live on Entropy. They click the button. We have to do all of the stream stuff. I'll do this while we introduce what we're reading. So we are looking today at the Conquest of the United States by Spain, which is a speech delivered at Yale University in 1899 by William Graham Sumner. Ryan, would you like to give us a bit of background on Sumner and this speech?
Yes. William Graham Sumner was born in 1840 in New Jersey to English immigrants. So he was of Anglo stock, but he was not of colonial stock, shall we say. Regardless of that, he was a very hardcore laissez-faire advocate in the late 20th century. I believe he lived until about 1910, dying just before World War I, and the full advent of progressivism supplanting his ideology. So that's sort of the context in which he's writing most of this. For instance, he was staunchly against tariffs. He was in favor of hard money, gold in particular. He has been, at least I think, falsely criticized as being a social Darwinist because of his ties to Herbert Spencer, and definitely there is a potential to interpret him that way. But if you read him, it seems that he is much more in favor of just letting people sort out their own lives and through limited charity where it matters. So that's the sort of this is sort of the wasp that we're dealing with here. He was trained as an Anglican clergyman, for instance. Later went on to basically found the field of sociology in the United States university systems. So he's a very well-educated and foundational figure in United States history. And beyond that, he is very anti-imperial in his politics, going on to chair the Anti-Imperialist League in the United States after the Spanish-American War. So that's the background of Sumner, and that's where the speech is being given.
It sounds like you've leaned away from your microphone a little bit, so you might want to lean in a bit, perhaps, because I know you're on the laptop or something.
Yeah, okay. I did not lean back, so that may be a problem.
You just sound different than when we were talking before for some reason, like a little bit low or cutting out a little bit, but it's fine. Okay, so yeah, thank you for giving us that introduction. Mr. Bagby, would you like to say anything in introduction to this essay and the topics it covers?
Yeah, Sumner is presenting the traditional American foreign policy from George Washington to Grover Cleveland. He is turning things on their heads, as it were. The title of his talk being "The Conquest of the United States by Spain," which is the exact opposite of what everyone has observed with the Spanish-American War. The United States very rapidly takes Spanish possessions in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and so he's playing that aspect up, the absurdity of the talk, by highlighting how the United States is becoming an imperial power. The United States is adopting uh, they're adopting the imperial perspective of the old European powers, which traditionally they had rejected. So the tradition that he's highlighting comes from Washington's farewell address and from the likes of people like John Quincy Adams, who says in a speech as Secretary of State, America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. The the self-cultivation of the early republic, as opposed to the expansionist industrial power that develops after the Civil War, that is growing in more along the lines of one of those European imperial powers. So the major antagonism there inside of the American tradition is between the Hamiltonian imperial ambition that is modeling Americans after the British Empire, and the Jeffersonian tradition, which is more internally focused, much more agrarian, and much more free trade.
Now, people like to blame Woodrow Wilson a lot for the mistake of getting America involved in European affairs, but I think that is a bit unfair to Wilson in the sense that there's a through line that led to the calamities of the 20th century and America's participation in them in particular, starting, at least having been started here by the American government, which is what Sumner is speaking against. So we need to draw this through line about empire building to Wilson's actions in the First World War and everything beyond that in the 20th century. It doesn't just suddenly start there. American imperialism, empire building, it doesn't simply start there in the 20th century. And Sumner presents a very good case that empire building is not a good thing because it's fundamentally incompatible with America's form of government, which is the ideal model is the Jeffersonian model. And if we build an empire, then we will have to govern ourselves at home as an empire as well. You can't have two systems of government in one civilization. One of them has to go. So,
and that's specifically part of his point, because there is a second point that's laden throughout the entire speech, which is not just that it will contradict fundamentally our form of government, but also that it will solely be for the benefit of the people that we are civilizing or colonizing, and at our expense in terms of blood, morality, society, and money, of course. So not only is it harmful to our very unique form of government that is peculiar to our people, but in the course of trying to implement this form of government on people to which cannot be ruled by it, we fundamentally harm our own people, our heritage, and our traditions. So this is the other thing as well. It's almost Spinglerian, I want to say, this idea that the transition into empire will harm the tradition, the culture, the fundamental character of the people. So this is kind of why I find the essay interesting still.
So with that, shall we read some selections from the essay? Or also, I think Mr. Bagby may have wanted to read something secondary to this as well. I'm not sure which one we should start with.
Let's start with Sumner.
Okay. So I have some selections from later in the essay. Which among you would like to read any selection from the essay first?
If I can, I have a lot that are at the front. Do you mind if I just read off a couple of those first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Because I think it's good, especially to get the first 3 paragraphs out. And by the way, once again, you can find this speech for free online in many different places if you want to read it yourself. But I think the first 3 paragraphs, he gives the situation, the summary of the situation very well. And just very briefly, I'll read them here. Sumner writes, during the last year, the public has been familiarized with the descriptions of Spain and of Spanish methods of doing things, until the name of Spain has become a symbol for a certain well-defined set of notions and policies. On the other hand, the name of the United States has always been, for all of us, a symbol for a state of things, a set of ideas and traditions, a group of views about social and political affairs. So I'll stop there. Sumner is not saying the United States is an idea or that it's a creed. or something to that effect. What Sumner is specifically saying is that the United States, through its actions, has come to embody a certain form of morality that's peculiar to the people. Were you all able to hear that all right?
Mostly. Did you like move or something as soon as you started reading? Because it just sounded different immediately.
No, I did not.
Whatever.
So, okay.
We got most of it.
And then I'll continue, leaning in even more and being even louder. He continues, Spain was the first, for a long time the greatest, of the modern imperialistic states. The United States, by its historical origin, its traditions, and its principles, is the chief representative of the revolt and reaction against that kind of a state. I intend to show that, by the line of action now proposed to us, which we call expansion and imperialism, we are throwing away some of the most important elements of the American symbol and are adopting some of the most important elements of the Spanish symbol. So this is specifically Sumner saying that by conquering Spanish possessions, we are morphing or evolving, perhaps, into Spain when everything about our people, our traditions, and our heritage was the exact antithesis of what Spain was. So did that come through clearly?
Oh yeah, that was clear.
Cool.
Yes.
And then the last paragraph from the beginning that I would like to read, Sumner says, "We have beaten Spain in a military conflict, but we are submitting to be conquered by her on the field of ideas and policies. Expansionism and imperialism are nothing but the old philosophies of national prosperity which have brought Spain to where she is now. Those philosophies appeal to national vanity and national cupidity. They are seductive, especially upon the first view and the most superficial judgment, and therefore it cannot be denied that they are very strong for popular effect. They are delusions, and they will lead us to ruin unless we are hard-headed enough to resist them. In any case, the year 1898 is a great landmark in the history of the United States." So I think the introduction sort of speaks for itself, but that's where Sumner, William Graham Sumner is starting.
Yeah, and of course, this theme of not wanting to become like the old world European powers is basically the whole point of the essay. And you have to remember, I was watching some videos earlier actually on the war against Mexico that occurred, close to 100 years before this conflict that he's discussing right now, when Texas had just been annexed. And the counts of troops in these American battles are kind of weird when you like studying historical battles, because it's like 1,000, several thousand, 4,000 troops maybe attacking the Mexican city of Monterrey or something. There's a few hundred casualties. California is like conquered with a few hundred soldiers basically, but virtually at the same time you have the Americans are looking at the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and of course Sumner here is going to be looking back on those wars as well and looking at the millions of, I believe the fatalities were above 1 million on the French and then the coalition sides each during the Napoleonic Wars, which is just an unbelievable amount of death. Battles would have 10,000 people, 30,000 people dying in them. So when Sumner is talking about the fruits of imperialism, that's really what he's looking at, the total destruction of a society, which is what the Europeans spent the beginning part of the 19th century doing for themselves. So where do we want to go from there?
Well,
So
Sumner.
Oh yeah, you first.
Sumner is entirely right. 1898 is the watershed moment. This is a major change in American self-conception. This is the moment where the United States becomes a global empire. And this is how the Republican leadership describes American foreign policy at this stage, that the United States is equal to the Germans who are expanding their empire abroad. They're equal to the French. They're equal to the British, who have this global stance and all of these concerns far away with other nations, which they're cultivating in some way. They're ruling as territories and educating them for something greater in the future. And this is a very important moment in our history. We can see in this the genesis of all of the imperialist ambitions in the 20th century that have become so current in our politics, especially what we call the neoconservative right. It's the moment these things start getting rhetoricized and rationalized.
Right, and this is Sumner. Actually, the next part I had is where he outlines the contradiction with that rhetoric that we've been given. The next paragraph that I have highlighted, Sumner says, "There is another observation, however, about the war which is of far greater importance. That is, that it was a gross violation of self-government. We boast that we are a self-governing people, and in this respect particularly, we compare ourselves with pride with older nations. What is the difference after all? The Russians, whom we always think of as standing as the opposite pole of political institutions, have self-government, if you mean by it acquiescence in what a little group of people at the head of the government agreed to do." So what Sumner is saying here is popular in rhetoric at the time that I think a lot of Americans don't get taught, which is that Russia was like the oldest monarchy in Europe in terms of how it was structured, at least how it came off. It was seen as archaic, decrepit, tyrannical above all else, and the United States was often portrayed as the opposite of that. Because we had self-government, because our people were capable, they came from certain traditions and heritages which allowed them to govern themselves. They did not need to be served.
Yeah, and of course that's a mostly accurate, at least, view of what the Russian state was at the time as well. One of the things about this phase of the United States is some people will look on this period as like based, like, we're doing these based Monroe Doctrine like wars against our neighbors to control our hemisphere, right? And that's the Monroe Doctrine. Of course, as we covered last week, that's not what the Monroe Doctrine was. I can't really help but think about what the current government is looking at doing in Venezuela in relation to all of this stuff. And, you know, this sort of rhetoric, this point he's making here, this sort of principled point about we're a self-governing people and imposing governments on other places, which is specifically against the Monroe Doctrine, by the way. This sort of thing was like used to argue against the Iraq War and stuff, especially by libertarians. The second Iraq War, I mean, but probably the first one as well. Of course, I was a little babby, so I don't know. But the second Iraq War, where Saddam was actually executed, this sort of rhetoric was used then as well. And of course, it's libertarians tend to get dismissed. Probably on the anti-war point, it's like the one place you really do not want to dismiss libertarians, I think. And it's like people want to have their cake and eat it too. Like going to war with everyone to take over all the countries in your sphere is like cool and good. Maybe even going a little war on the opposite side of the planet. That's like cool and it feels good and like, oh, look how strong we are. But then as you don't get a republic, a self-governing republic plus empire without bringing the empire home. I mean, I remember that this is a point that was made about the Iraq War a lot, and is made about pretty much every other war that the U.S. gets involved in, often by the libertarian section of the right. And well, it's true. So I don't want to just say, well, you have to, despise all of the leaders of the American government of this era or something, because that's not what we're trying to do in the show. But we are trying to assess our actual history here, and how good was it really for America to start getting involved in empire building? Because almost immediately after the empire building started, we get to the world wars. There's not really a gap there. It happens immediately. So back to you guys.
Well, it's something that Sumner says in his speech that struck me, and I wrote it all down. He said, if it is not an established rule of statecraft that a statesman should never impose any sacrifices on his people for anything but their own interests, then it is useless to study political philosophy anymore. And that struck me particularly because this is something very much in our discussion right now. We're often talking about foreign policy because it's quite a plague in our political controversies, our discourses. We are drawn into foreign disputes all over the place, and we're constantly asking ourselves the question, what does this have to do with us? What would we stand to gain in Venezuela, for instance, or Ukraine or Gaza? What does this have to do with us? Why are we there? And Sumner says that the example of the Spanish War is the prime example of the political class doing something to benefit some special interest, not the people at large, that this is not something beneficial to the country, that this is serving some special group. And now we look around, and it seems that is the case in most areas where we're drawn into these conflicts. This is a very important add-on. He says this is the moment where our foreign policy is fundamentally changing, and once again, it seems to me that is entirely apropos. This is when our foreign policy is falling into the grasp of special groups. They've gotten their hands on the levers of power, as it were.
Right, and this is a point that Sumner will especially elaborate on and sort of tear into this national interest argument, and with great ferocity later on. But just right before we lose the train of thought that Charlie was bringing up, the next paragraph I had highlighted by Sumner, I think, actually goes on into this this idea of like the based interventionism because it's good for our national strength or something to that effect. So this is something that Sumner explicitly tackles because it was such a strong rhetorical force whenever he was writing this. So Sumner says, at present, the whole periodical press of the country seems to be occupied in tickling the national vanity to the utmost by representations about the war which are extravagant and fantastic. There will be a penalty to be paid for all this. Nervous and sensational newspapers are just as corrupting, especially to young people, as nervous and sensational novels. The habit of expecting that all mental pabulum shall be highly spiced and the corresponding loathing for whatever is soberly truthful undermines character as much as any other vice. Patriotism is being prostituted into nervous toxication, which is fatal to an apprehension of truth. It builds around us a fool's paradise, and it will lead us into errors about our position and relations, just like those which we have been ridiculing in the case of Spain. And this is, I feel like this could have been written by like an Our Guy on Twitter, maybe an Anon account today, perhaps a slightly more modern language, because this is the exact same effect that we see. There will be some very pro-governmental post about American sovereignty. It's based actually, and it owns the libertarians. If we do send hundreds of thousands of our men and trillions of dollars over to some third world hellhole in order to develop it for the people that hate us, and not to actually develop it, but to pay for our own national industries that are involved in it. That's based actually because it looks tough on the national scale. It's patriotic. You hate the country if you don't want it to be intervening the world around because you think that we're weak or something to that effect. It's happening right now. You can find it on Twitter or on any of the social media platform. This very strange pro-Trump but also open to interventionist group that's been emerging. So I found that paragraph particularly prescient when I reread it.
Historically, when we're talking about this period, we're always bringing up the role of the sensationalist press, the tabloid press. This is the era of the great media moguls, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, who are creating these coordinated media empires across the country. Hearst has a great many cities, many major newspapers in his syndicate. Pulitzer has only two major newspapers, one in New York and one in St. Louis, but both of them are extremely powerful and they're playing off one another. They are trying to find the most sensational, the most morbid stories in the country, and they patronize these journalists that peddle these kinds of stories, and they want to splash them on the front pages. They want to make them the talk of the news of the day, and so they're vulgarizing media with these wild tales of what Richard Weaver describes as the true obscenities, the agonized face of the woman run over by the subway train, and all these scenes of intense private grief or embarrassment or morbid crimes and such. Now, this is something that both Pulitzer and Hearst get very involved with, and this is one of the reasons why we see Sumner and others. They're always talking about this in relation to the lead up of the war against Spain, because the yellow journalists are embedded in the Cuban rebel army. They're sending reporters, they're sending photographers to Cuba. It's a very famous instance early on in American involvement and interest in the Cuban Revolution, this ongoing process leading up to the declaration of war in 1898. One of William Randolph Hearst's reporters sends him a telegram from Havana, and he says, "Well, I'm here in Havana, and everything seems hunky dory. I don't see anything going on." And Hearst wires him back. One of his most famous instructions in his whole career. He said, "You provide the photographs, and I will provide the war. All I need is photographs of the lines," or something. And so Hearst is looking for drama, and he wants to sensationalize it. And this is something that the great media tycoons of the day are doing. They are sending American reporters down to Cuba. America has interests there. This is a really important element in the lead up, because we've talked in other contexts about the Turner thesis about the closing of the frontier. And this turns American entrepreneurs abroad. They start looking towards Canada. They start looking towards Mexico. They start looking towards adjoining islands. They're looking at Hawaii. They're looking at Cuba. They're looking at Puerto Rico and places like that. They're wanting to develop nearby industries. The capital is kind of flowing out of the country at this point because the easily developed lands and industries in the continental United States, they've already been identified. the easy pickings have already been claimed. And so capital now is looking near abroad. And there are hundreds of millions of American investment dollars that are going down to Cuba. So when the war breaks out between the Cuban independence revolutionaries, the Cuban Republicans, and the Spanish Empire, the Americans are going there to document the goings on of American businessmen and American investments. Americans are losing a lot of investments there. They are aggrieved. These are a special interest, these foreign investors in Cuba. And this draws in American media attention. And the media attention is quite varied. It is really extraordinary. It is really overblown. The reporters are making up fantastic tales of all female militia Republican regiments. They call them the Amazons of Cuba. So they actually send down people like Frederick Remington, the great artist, the great sculptor and painter of the American West. Remington actually gets a major break by going to Cuba and painting and illustrating for the newspapers drawings from the front. And Remington even produces images of these fighting young beauties of the Cuban revolutionaries on the front lines against the brutal Spanish dictatorship or whatever. And this has a major splash. There are a lot of really weird people involved with this, including Verena Davis, the wife of former President Jefferson Davis. People like Joseph Pulitzer actually go down and meet with Verena Davis in Gulfport, Mississippi, and get her to write editorials because she has a certain clout and a certain prominence, and she is very pro-Cuba Republican, and she's writing about these alleged outrages of these Cuban revolutionary girls that get captured by the Spaniards. They get searched for contraband, for correspondence with the rebel leaders and such, and allegedly they're humiliated in front of the Spanish officers while they're getting searched and pried for information. And she writes, Mrs. Davis, the former president's wife, she writes about this in Pulitzer's newspaper. So there are all these interesting angles, and there are all these ridiculous and fabricated stories, like the story of the female militia regiments fighting the Spaniards and such. This is what we call the yellow journalism that predominates in this period, and it is a degradation of journalism. Journalism used to have a higher reputation in American history, and it makes such an impression on the people at the time. You see this widespread revulsion by the learned, by the cultured, that this really is an obscenity that has become a commonplace in America. This is like a degradation that's bringing down the reading public and corrupting them. And what's it corrupting them for? Is there a use for this? Sumner identifies it. It's a corruption in the interest of a special investment.
Yes, I'm very glad that that you're telling the full story behind the yellow journalism. I certainly know that in the majority of places that this is taught, it's just like the history teachers, the textbooks, the very modern historians pretend that like 1898 was the first year that a newspaper was subject to profit at all, and therefore yellow journalism suddenly appeared. In actuality, and this is what Sumner hammers on throughout this speech of his, there were very particular investors whose interests were benefited by, especially Hertz and Pulitzer, printing on their behalf and spurring the military and the bureaucracy to provide benefit for them and security in their investment. It's a very particular form of profit that doesn't have the same connotation, perhaps, as a lot of people put it. And I think that really sort of explains why suddenly now it's not like the newspapers were all not subject to monetary concerns before now, but it was as you say, there was a very specific history of capital flying out of the country and into Cuba, and that just so happened to provide the newspapers with some very good political connections. Um, just to sort of move on just a little bit, because this will continue to come back up throughout the speech. But this is something else that I find interesting. There's another argument that he briefly addresses in favor of imperialism, and it's very similar to what a certain James Burnham would argue. Specifically, the empire is inevitable. So if the United States does not engage in imperialism, it is going to be put behind all of the other powers, and that will just be a detriment to us in the long run. So we just need to deal with empire in a case-by-case basis, be pragmatic about it, not dogmatic. And Sumner addresses this very briefly, but I think quite profoundly. And he says, "There are some now who think that it is the perfection of statesmanship to say that expansion is a fact and that it is useless to discuss it. We are told that we must not cross any bridges until we come to them. That is, that we must discuss nothing in advance, and that we must not discuss anything which is past because it is irretrievable. No doubt, this would be a very acceptable doctrine to the powers that be, for it would mean that they were relieved from responsibility. But it would be a marvelous doctrine to be accepted by a self-governing people." So he ties it into the main point that he's speaking about throughout the speech, but I find it fascinating that he refutes it just by saying that, like, the aspiring imperial powers inside the republic would love this doctrine because it relieves them of responsibility. This idea of pragmatism is very often used, I think, to just justify doing whatever the people wielding the power want to do, without any regard for future considerations or any links to the past. I think he's hit the nail on the head here. And this is a line of reasoning that I especially see in the online right still today. This idea that we can just be pragmatic, sort of amoral in how we go about things in the world, because it may or may not be to our interest. But what Sumner is saying here is that there is such a thing as a responsibility that is tied to both the past and the future, that we can't just ignore because it looks good on paper, say. Bagby, I don't know if you had any comment on that, but just that was something that stood out to me, this very brief paragraph that he immediately moves on from.
It does stand out to me, and what most comes to my mind is that this is the time of a pivot from an America where people really did have a lot of personal responsibility, an America of small businesses and small farms, pivoting to the America of the tycoon, the America of the Wall Street investor, the America of the mass man, the city dweller, Hamilton's vision of most Americans working for wages, having money in their pockets, buying goods and services, trading their savings in the markets, and having less responsibility. Ultimately, responsibility gets concentrated in the hands of the collective mover and shaker in society, the tycoon, the Gilded Age figure. That becomes the world that we live in, the world of managers, the world of corporate interests, the world of the suburbs and the Walmart and the car dealership. That wasn't Sumner's world. Sumner was looking at America in 1898, where the preponderance of people still lived in direct contact with agriculture, that most Americans did not live in cities, that most Americans owned their own property, took responsibility for their own futures. And we see a tipping point. Now, it's not quite there. It's actually between World War I and World War II, where most Americans changed from living directly connected with agriculture to being employees in cities. That's where the real tipping point is in our history. But just the same, we have these two very distinct visions of American history. We have the Jeffersonian vision, which is the empire of liberty as Jefferson had it. This is how he justifies the Louisiana Purchase. He envisions, many, many generations of freeholding farmers in America. And these are people that are independent of any centralized interest, any capitalist interest. They don't have to work for anybody. They don't need money to survive. They don't need money to rent. They don't need money to buy food. They are farmers, which means that they can get everything that they need from the land itself. It's a real kind of independence and responsibility. Well, it shifts over to Hamilton's vision, and Hamilton's vision is one of the great themes of this subject. Why did a subset of Americans desire empire? It is ultimately that Hamiltonian tradition. It is the temptation that was there from the start. And this is, I risk offending my panel members here. This is one of the great American traditions, and it's the one that we live in now. And I think it's much to our detriment that it has been so thoroughly victorious on all fronts. Even Hamilton himself would be scandalized by how far it has gone. But it's Hamilton's vision that governs the country that we live in now. And we see one of Hamilton's major victories there in 1898, the victory of his disciples, as it were.
Right. And this is we've talked about this vision coming to fruition over time, intermittently on this in this series, especially when we were going over Beard's analysis of the Constitution. Charlie, if I'm not mistaken, I think that you're back in some capacity. Do you have any comments so far, if you are back?
I should be back now. I've joined as a guest
Yes.
on the stream, so I should sound fine now. But you guys keep going. I'm trying to reintegrate with where you guys are in the story here.
Okay. All right. Yes, and I don't really, I can't really add much to what Bagby was saying there. He's a very well-spoken gentleman. So the next part of the speech that I have highlighted is sort of really driving home this point about the glory of empire being a very seductive incentive. And Sumner writes, "The perpetuity of self-government depends on the sound political sense of the people, and sound political sense is a matter of habit and practice. We can give it up, and we can take instead pomp and glory. That is what Spain did. She had as much self-government as any country in Europe at the beginning of the 16th century. The union of the smaller states into one big one gave an impulse to her national feeling and national development. The discovery of America put into her hands the control of immense territories. National pride and ambition were stimulated. Then came the struggle with France for world dominion, which resulted in absolute monarchy and bankruptcy for Spain. She lost self-government and saw her resources spent on interests which were foreign to her, but she could talk about an empire on which the sun never set and boast of her colonies, her gold mines, her fleets and armies, and debts. She had glory and pride, mixed, of course, with defeat and disaster, such as must be experienced by any nation on that course of policy. And she grew weaker in her industry and commerce, and poorer in the status of the population all the time. She has never been able to recover real self-government yet. If we Americans believe in self-government, why do we let it slip away from us? Why do we barter it away for military glory, as Spain did?" So this is very interesting to think about, that Sumner died before, say, the First World War. But that whole paragraph feels like he could have been writing it about the trajectory of the United States after World War II. We had this quest against a large foreign power for world dominion, essentially. And somehow, in the course of all of this, it never seems to be in the interest of the American people that this is all done. Even in the modern day, when that other world power is gone, this always seems to be in the benefit of foreign nations, much tinier ones, say. So this is a very far-sighted paragraph. I feel like it could be stated verbatim about the United States after World War II and into the present.
Absolutely.
Well, I was going to say that less than 50 years after that was written, exactly what he wrote there and possibly worse happened to the British Empire and their state as well before it happened to America. So they're another example of exactly what he is warning about here.
Yeah, the degradation of the population, the decline of the native industry, you wouldn't have bet on that for an empire like Spain's, but it's most certainly what happened.
Right, and once again, not to the benefit of the Spanish people. In fact, and Sumner, this is a major theme throughout everything that we aren't particularly reading from this speech. But Sumner lists in excruciating detail just how much, say, the Spanish people or the Spanish colonists or the Spaniards, even just slightly below the most immediate beneficients of the empire, have suffered as a result of its national policy throughout the early modern to the present, at least when he's writing. And it's harrowing to think about if that's the model that we're on, which Sumner is arguing, and I think he's been entirely correct that this is the system that our elites and politicians have chosen for us. It's quite harrowing to think about what that means for us and our children in the next couple of centuries. So a bit of a black pill, if you will.
It's a instructive story, and it reminds me of the phrase that was once said of Bismarck's Germany, where money accumulates and men decay. The Spanish Empire was extremely wealthy in the precious metals and gold and silver, and ironically, the huge import from South America of gold and of silver caused inflation in Spain and beggared her in unusual ways. It just decreased the value of the hoards of those metals, and the Spanish became indebted. They had to fund their military and send huge formations far away. They had to fund their navy because their navy was so far flung across their gigantic empire, and so on. And they fell into increasing debts and liabilities as their empire grew away from them, where you see the rise of Simon Bolivar down in South America, and we see all the successful revolutions against the Spanish colonies in South America and Central America, until by 1898, it's only the Philippines and Cuba and a couple other smaller holdings that Spain has left. Those are all that's left of the great Spanish Empire. And it's those circumstances that Spain is trying to fight to retain. In a way, they're fighting for the remnants of their old tradition. They're fighting for their imperial legacy by contending with Philippine rebels, by fighting for years and losing tens of thousands of infantry just in Cuba alone before the American intervention in 1898.
So this is good because the next thing that I had highlighted, just kind of it's Sumner talking about this exact problem, and I'll briefly read this out, and hopefully it will elicit more comment from you, because I think we on the panel and the audience are very much interested in your commentary. So Sumner on this issue says later on in the speech, Spain possesses a large literature from the last 3 centuries, in which her publicists discuss with amazement the question whether it was a blessing or a curse to get the Indies, and why, with all the supposed conditions of prosperity in her hands, she was declining all the time. We now hear it argued that she is well rid of her colonies, and that if she will devote her energies to her internal development and rid her politics of the corruption of colonial officials and interests, she may be regenerated. That is a rational opinion. It is the best diagnosis of her condition and the best prescription of a remedy which the occasion has called forth. But what then will happen to the state which has taken over her colonies? I can see no answer except that nation, with them, has taken over the disease, and that it is now to be corrupted by exploiting dependent communities, just as she has been. That it stands exposed to this danger is undeniable. So I feel like that's exactly, or perhaps maybe a different angle on what you were just saying. Sumner here is saying that Spain's possession of these prosperous and resource-rich lands halfway across the world is specifically what doomed her. The extraction economy was part of her downfall. The Spanish people obviously didn't see much benefit. The attempt to pull the colonies towards Spain against this natural drift, which a separation by an ocean would bring, led to her economy being based off of the interests of these territorial governors, which also was not in the interest of the people of Spain. And then this is the interesting part, and Sumner makes this point. It's not just the American classical liberals that Sumner is speaking on behalf of, who think that Spain getting rid of the colonies would be an unambiguous good thing for Spain. This was a very widely accepted idea at the time. In fact, if I remember, it was very few statesmen in Europe that specifically wanted Spain to have her colony still for the benefit of Spain. Yeah, even I believe it was Bismarck that supported Spain's defense against the Americans. But even then, in pure Bismarckian terms, that's not necessarily because it's for the benefit of the old order. It's something that Spain has to deal with. It would indebt Spain to Germany for helping Spain defend the colonies, and it weakens another European power, makes them more dependent on Germany. So even the supposed allies of Spain during this time were considering helping Spain because it would weaken her to keep the colonies. I think this is you can see this. We sort of speed ran this with our imperial ambitions, especially in the last few decades. I don't think a single person would say that we got benefit from occupying Afghanistan and Iraq, for instance.
Indeed.
Except a lot of the national interests, which were charged with redeveloping them. But otherwise, everything else has completely declined. It's sort of like we saw what Spain did over the course of a few centuries and decided we would do it over the course of a decade and a half.
Well, we can certainly understand Spain's position when we can look at one of their former possessions, which is now ours, in the island of Puerto Rico. Spain certainly would have benefited by spinning Puerto Rico off into independence or something. I don't know what, just as we would. The island has been nothing but a drain on resources ever since we've acquired it, and the source of nationalist terrorism, attempts to assassinate Harry Truman, shooters that go and shoot at people inside the United States Capitol building, things like that. That's maybe some of the most colorful things to come out of Puerto Rico, but the rest of it is more evident in that they've colonized parts of our country. I believe there are more Puerto Ricans in New York than there are in Puerto Rico proper anymore. And the island itself is extremely dysfunctional and quite dependent on federal aid today. It's an irony because the politics there are quite split between people that want continued federal aid and statehood, and those that are set on independence for the island, which is a very old stance there, and they kind of opt out of the local politics because they think it discredits them. But a really curious problem very interesting little place. But we don't feel that way about other colonial dependencies. I want to ask you gentlemen about this particularly. We don't feel this way about Alaska, do we? Do we feel this way about Hawaii? What say you?
Personally, I don't believe Hawaii should be a state or a possession of the United States in any sense. Alaska is on the continent, so I think it's perfectly fine for it to be a state and held by the United States. Puerto Rico should also be simply released, of course.
Well, but as regards the policy, and some very similar to what Charlie is saying here, I think that we can see that Hawaii has been very much a net drain on the United States, except perhaps for a few sugar interests and naval interests, as well as perhaps provoking a major war. But with but with Alaska, it was barely inhabited. It was there were obviously European peoples there. The Russians and some British. There were Indians as well. But for the vast majority of it, it could just be settled by Americans from the continent that were content to go into harsh climates for search of wealth or isolation from the rest of the world, much like the settling of the West was done. So I don't think that we feel it safe for Alaska. I feel like the effects that we would feel from Hawaii are obscured by its statehood. But that would be my assessment. I don't know if that screws up a point that you were making, but that's I guess my nuance, I suppose.
Well, I think they're different situations. I think each one of them has its own story. And I think that we would feel differently about Hawaii if it was populated with Puerto Ricans, just as we feel differently about Puerto Rico if it was mostly Japanese, as Hawaii is today, or if it had the same prominence as a military installation. But Hawaii certainly is a kind of drain. You know, it's mostly military, but it was a major center, also connected to the Spanish War. It's one of those auxiliary conquests of the Spanish War. Nothing to do with Spain. It was an independent Polynesian kingdom, but it was captured in the climate of the Spanish-American War because we needed a way to project power and maintain our holdings in the Philippines. And so it became a casualty of the war. The sovereignty of the Polynesian Kingdom of Hawaii was a casualty of the Spanish-American War. It became a fait accompli when we decided to take the Philippines. So that in itself is an interesting connection. The reason why the American government decided they had to have Hawaii was because they were going to have an empire in Asia. That's why they had to have Hawaii. The one led to the other inevitably.
Yeah, and this is good because when I was rereading this in preparation for the stream, I was thinking about the contention of several members of the European right, say, talking about an American empire in Europe, but despite my grievances with a lot of their portrayals of that, I feel like any claims of an American empire would be much more suited for our actions in Asia and South Asia, especially as we have suffered the downsides of empire most observably in Asia. And certainly most of our politicians, if you read through the congressional records talking about interventions into Asia, seem like they also view that Asia is the place for an American empire. So this is something I find interesting. There's a very, I would say, justified allergic reaction for most of our people, especially in the old Glory Club, against this term American empire. But at least from my reckoning, it seems like our expansion into Asia, of course, with this being spurred on by the Spanish-American War and then continuing throughout the World Wars and the Cold War, I feel like the actual criticisms there belong, our actions there, as well as the downsides. We can very easily observe our net drains from having done this. So this was an idea that I had before the stream, but perhaps you have a comment on that.
Yes, well, the criticisms of empire belong to the actually existing American empire that we once had. Yeah, I don't think most normies even realize that the United States owned these random islands in the Far East called the Philippines. And this is one of the reasons why the United States was attacked in Hawaii and the Philippines simultaneously by the Japanese in World War II. It's not like Hawaii was the extent of American imperial ambitions in the Far East. The Philippines are, quite close to China and the Japanese islands, relatively speaking. And when you look at the war that occurred for those islands, all the infamous Bataan Death March. I mean, what was the ultimate value of that possession? What was the value of Hawaii?
It was all to project power and influence in Asia. We had acquired these colonies from Spain. They had two major attributes that all great industrial powers require. They provided us with raw materials, and they were captive markets to buy our products. We controlled their trade because they were our territories. And so we could dictate who they were importing from, who they had business relationships with. And they had preferential business relationships with us because we owned them. So we exported their raw materials in the Philippines. Rubber was a particular concern, and this is in the boom times of our initial industrial base. We need a lot of natural latex and things like that for our own industries. We need access to these tropical islands and such. We have special need to get at guano deposits in the Pacific. There's a kind of race to get to these really obscure uninhabited islands because we have yet to fix artificial nitrogen. The Bosch process is still is just on the cusp of being generalized, popularized. The artificial fixing of nitrogen with electricity. So we're
Very
looking
good.
far
So,
and wide.
with that, just in the interest of continuing our progression through the speech,
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, and sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I feel like we could be here for hours and hours, especially listening to you in particular. So you are the star guest of this show. But in the interest of continuing, Sumner later on in the speech points out a line of reasoning that I think gets overlooked both by the anti-imperialists of this era and then later on the isolationists, and also by the people who think they understand the anti-imperialist idea. And I'm not going to go beyond that. I'm just going to read from Sumner, but see if hopefully that'll make sense. Sumner writes, "In the first place, Spain never intended of set purpose to ruin the material prosperity of herself or her colonies. Her economic history is one long lesson to prove that any prosperity policy regarding empire is a delusion and a path to ruin. There is no economic lesson which the people of the United States need to take to heart more than that. In the second place, the Spanish mistakes arose, in part, from confusing the public treasury with the national wealth. They thought that, when gold flowed into the public treasury, that was the same as an increase of wealth of the people. It really meant that the people were bearing the burdens of the imperial system, and that the profits of it went into the public treasury, that is, into the hands of the king. It was no wonder, then, that as the burdens grew greater, the people grew poorer. The king spent the revenues in extending the imperial system in Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, so that the revenues really became a new cause of corruption and decay. the only people who were well off in the midst of the increasing distress were the ecclesiastics and nobles, who were protected by entails and charters, which, in their turn, were a new cause of restriction and destruction to the industries of the country. So, with the point that I started with, Sumner is specifically pointing out this process that I think gets ignored all too often, which is that, sure, every advocate of empire usually has nothing but the best intentions for, say, the national interest, the public, or whomever else. But the actual process of maintaining the empire, using it, or even trying to extract any value out of it, that process is why it will always fail. And this is not some sort of dogmatic thing that's being pointed out here. It's just this idea that we can make everyone in the home country rich by having the empire. By necessity, having the empire entails that the home country will have to outpour its blood, its resources, and its efforts into maintaining this thing for which it's supposed to provide them more of all three of those things. So this was a very good point by Sumner. And then the second thing, and I suppose this delights my libertarian sensibilities, he points out as well that there's a category error. When people look at the accounts of, at the time it would have been the public accounts, the crown's debts, its revenues and expenses. But perhaps for us in the wake of Iraq, it would be the revenues and expenses of the military-industrial complex. I don't think that the public treasury on our part has seen much benefit from our imperial endeavors, but there are many people related to the public treasury, but not necessarily in it, that have. So this is something else, is that if you actually look past the farthest aggregate that you can get of the country, and you actually look into where the money is going and how it's being used, on both counts, this idea of empire never actually ends up benefiting the people, the home country for whom it's meant to benefit. And beyond that, it benefits the people leading this new empire, who then seek to suppress the home country. So this was my thoughts when I highlighted this. I think that the implications are very clear for the United States. This is what I was born into. It's what both of you have seen develop over time.
I think
Yeah.
that it does. I think it does interest a specialized group. I think it does interest those industries that need access to those raw materials, that benefit from captive markets to export to. It does benefit the military industries, who see a new influx of investment from the government because now they have to maintain a global empire. And those particular interests will lobby for this policy. So when the business of America becomes international exports because the American marketplace is already saturated, there accumulates these goods from the factories, and in order to keep the people employed at the factories and keep people busy in the offices, they must increasingly export this stuff. Then the quest for international trade share becomes very important. Now, this is the kind of empire that historically has made sense for America. I want to just put that out there. We don't look at the America of 1900 as an America that is greatly stilted, deindustrialized, debt-ridden. No, that's our America. And I think that we can look at the trade policies of McKinley and his success in the Spanish-American War. That was a time of booming industry, which is one of the reasons why he was reelected. That's one of the reasons why Theodore Roosevelt was a very popular president. We see the progressives ascendant in that time. And I don't think that that's merely coincidental. I think that America was rising and that Europe was falling at that same time. But I think that some of these policies make sense for that particular period. The time when we are exporting all of our industries and globalizing the trade market is the time where we're really falling apart economically here at home. And maybe that's an extension of some of those same policies, but nevertheless.
Right, and I didn't mean to say that this would happen all at once, and I think we skipped the part where Sumner explicitly says that it's not all good or all bad, and nor does it just immediately happen. You have to analyze it in history. But like I think that what you just said there would be heartily agreed with by Sumner, that there were certainly immediate benefits that were perhaps more dispersed to these policies. But certainly, as we've more intensively pursued the system, as you said towards the top of the stream, that the fervor with which we have pursued this Hamiltonian vision for the country would have even shocked Hamilton, for instance. I feel like that's where we would expect to see the greatest issues for the American people in regards to this policy. But Charlie, it looked like you might have been trying to jump in here.
Well, there's certainly a case for empire building on the continent. If you're building the empire, warring with Spain on the continent or Mexico on the continent, and taking territory under your control where your own people are going to settle and your own people are going to build industry and so forth. There's a key difference there in sort of that form of the Hamiltonian vision and just going and conquering a random island chain of Filipino natives and Hawaiian natives, and then utilizing that in this economic system that displaces your own industry at home. It's also the case that we don't measure national wealth anymore in terms of gold coming into the treasury, but we do in terms of GDP and foreign trade. Things like the war in Ukraine, for example, are great for both of these things, because now all of the European countries have to renew or create vast new contracts with the United States to rebuild their militaries that they've sent to Ukraine. The United States has to also do the same for stockpiles of weapons it's sent over there. And just look at all the trade opportunities that are going to open up once the war is completed with the rebuilding and everything. So there are all of these elements that play into this idea of the national treasury and all this money that can be spent and be brought in and then sent back out again. But none of that, as Sumner's saying as well, has anything to do with the actual prosperity of the people at home. They are not the beneficiaries of that number. Line go up, but prosperity do not.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point, and I wish I had thought of that now, because it's a very good one. But this is why many on our side impulsively attack the mainstream economists when they say the GDP is going up, so we're all better off. It's in the context of the speech, it definitely does sound like an argument. Gold is flowing into Spain, so the people of Spain are better off for the empire. This idea that Sumner attacks. I don't mean to cut off the discussion, but just in the interest of continuing to move on, because we're approaching at least the end for what I had highlighted, and I'm sure we'll have slightly more. But just to keep the conversation moving just a little bit, I wanted to move on to how Sumner specifically treats our form of government and the things which hold our society together, at least in the earlier parts of the Republic, and how he sees those things changing as the character of American policy changes in the world. And what I'm about to read, if you assume that Sumner is like some sort of a lefty or a libertine or an egalitarian or something, if you assume that, you're not going to understand what Sumner is saying. Just once again for context, Sumner had many criticisms of democracy, of this idea of just pure, unrestrained power of the people. He had feasible criticisms. He had doctrinal criticisms of this. He's not an ideologue, certainly. But he does recognize that this democratic idea is a dogma, especially within American society, and that it can, with limited success, work with the American society that it had found its place in. So, with that context, I'm going to read this paragraph from Sumner where he says, very objectively, I might add, "The Americans have been committed from the outset to the doctrine that all men are equal. We have elevated it into an absolute doctrine as a part of the theory of our social and political fabric. It has always been a domestic dogma in spite of its absolute form, and as a domestic dogma, it has always stood in glaring contradiction to the facts about Indians and Negroes and to our legislation about Chinamen. In its absolute form, it must, of course, apply to Kanakas, Malays, Tagals, and Chinese just as much as to Yankees, Germans, and Irish. It is an astonishing event that we have lived to see American arms carry this domestic dogma out where it must be tested in its application to uncivilized and half-civilized peoples. At the first touch of the test, we throw the doctrine away and adopt the Spanish doctrine. We are told by all the imperialists that these people are not fit for liberty and self-government, that it is rebellion for them to resist our beneficence. That we must send fleets and armies to kill them if they do it, that we must devise a government for them and administer it ourselves, that we may buy them or sell them as we please and dispose of their trade for our advantage. What is that but the policy of Spain to her dependencies? What can we expect as a consequence of it? Nothing but that it will bring us where Spain is now. And just quickly before we comment, because this will be one of the few times where I just do pure interpretation of what we've read, because he's been criticizing Spain very often throughout this speech, and he's saying that we have the American dogma of all men are created equal. The empire disregards that and adopts the Spanish doctrine. So you, the reader, probably hear this and think, therefore, Sumner is very partial to this idea that all men are equal. But he's not. What he's very much partial to is the conclusion of that. And like I said, he very much has criticisms of these egalitarian and democratic doctrines. And he'll explicitly state what he thinks the end point of the full American idea is, and it's not the empire. Rather, what Sumner is trying to say here is that it was in pursuit of this doctrine that we tried to acquire these states, this idea that we would export it to other people in the world without regard for who the people were. Maybe the system is not supposed to be for them, but now we have them. And despite the fact that we got these places and these peoples under the guise of exporting this doctrine, now the imperialists are going to disregard it and try to impose an empire upon these people because they too recognize that this can't be exported to the other peoples. Once again, Sumner has his own ideas about what to do with the empire that we'll get to in a moment. But I find this to be fascinating because even though on the face of it, it sounds like he's being a lefty, if you will, what he's actually saying here, I think, is in line with what many of us have been saying, especially in the face of a lot of conservatives or neocons that are arguing that we need to export the constitutional Republican form of government to the rest of the world. It's what we say in slightly different words is what Sumner was trying to say to the proponents of American empire in the late 1890s. Specifically, the people there are not meant to have this form of government. They can't handle it. The form of government that we have is very particular to us. It is domestic. The word domestic does a lot of heavy lifting here. So that was my thoughts on this. I don't know if either of you had any particular comments.
Well, one of the ways this was put at the time was that the Constitution does not follow the flag. That the flag had been staked on the Philippines, for instance, on Puerto Rico. That did not mean that the United States Constitution would be enforced on those places. It didn't mean necessarily that they would become citizens. Of course, it did in Puerto Rico's state in 1917. Partly to enable them to enlist in World War I, but didn't apply to the Philippines. So it's a curiosity there, and the left certainly likes to use it as a sign of the hypocrisy of the time, but it was not seen as hypocritical by the very supporters and boosters of the policy. They rested on the understanding they're ruling new caught sullen peoples in Rudyard Kipling's verse, that these people weren't capable of self-government according to these statesmen. By the way, that's where William Howard Taft came from. William Howard Taft, later president and Supreme Court justice, started out as Roosevelt's governor of the Philippines.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Yeah, that's very good. And sort of to this point, because this is interesting, you would think by the rhetoric that we just read, Sumner would be perhaps against that. But once again, if you do more reading on Sumner, which I assume most of us haven't, that'd be a very high expectation and unrealistic. What he's saying here is very much trying to point out a sort of incoherency in the other side. But he does continue to give his own thoughts on the matter. So along this line of thought, he says, "But then, if it is not right for us to hold these islands as dependencies, you may ask me whether I think that we ought to take them into our union, at least some of them, and let them help to govern us. Certainly not. If that question is raised, then the question whether they are, in our judgment, fit for self-government or not is in order. The American people since the Civil War have to a great extent lost sight of the fact that this state of ours, the United States of America, is a confederated state of a very peculiar and artificial form. It is not a state like the states of Europe, with the exception of Switzerland. The field for dogmatism in our day is not theology, it is political philosophy." And then just skipping ahead so as not to muddy the waters for our audience, he says, "It exactly suits the purposes of the curbstone statesman, this idea of sovereignty. He puts into it whatever he wants to get out of it again, and he has set to work lately to spin out a proof that the United States is a great imperialistic state, although the Constitution, which tells us just what it is and what it is not, is there to prove the contrary." So just really quick before I continue, because this is the next part is the punchline. Sumner is not giving like the usual American conservative argument that the Constitution is the special thing for Americans and whatnot else. What Sumner is really trying to emphasize here, and this is something that we've sort of been highlighting throughout American Spirits, is that the form of government and the situations which the American people have found themselves in throughout most of their history is peculiar to them. And it is because of the historical events which were associated with them and the characteristics of the people themselves that the American people have the form of government they have, and that they've carried out the policies that they have. So what Sumner is saying here, even though the language is perhaps too non-modern for us to immediately comprehend, what Sumner is saying here is somewhat radical. He's saying that the people that we have conquered are not Americans, essentially, and that we cannot just bring them in and expect them to be Americans, because that would be absurd. And he's sort of accusing the other side, perhaps polemically. I think this might be slightly unfair, but he's polemically accusing the other side of trying to make this happen by preparing them for self-government. And just to get to like what his conclusion is, what he thinks should be done with his consistency, he says, "It follows then that it is unwisdom to take into a state like this any foreign element which is not congenial to it. Any such element will act as a solvent upon it. Consequently, we are brought by our new conquests face to face with this dilemma. We must either hold them as inferior possessions, to be ruled and exploited by us after the fashion of the old colonial system, or we must take them in on an equality with ourselves, where they will help to govern us and to corrupt a political system which they do not understand and in which they cannot participate. From that dilemma, there is no escape except to give them independence and to let them work out their salvation or go without it." Once again, I think this is very prescient because especially after, say, the Civil Rights Act and then its application to United States immigration law, our elites have very much chosen for us the second option. We will import these people that we have, that the elites rather have a stake in influencing, and they will help govern us, and it will corrupt our system. They will not understand it, and they will corrupt it. For a while, we had the former system, which I think, can see in hindsight, was much better. Even if it was completely contrary to our people and our heritage, certainly the old colonial system is much better than this even more zany and corrupted idea that we have, that we can just bring in all of these people, regardless of their heritage, the characteristics of the people, and expect them to act like us. So I found this to be particularly radical.
Well, this is an interesting connection to the Spanish War and its legacy. Um, Sumner is actually one of the anti-imperialist organizers. There was a league of anti-imperialist writers and such. It included Mark Twain. It also included Senator George Hoar of Massachusetts. Lots of very interesting people involved. It had also Charles Francis Adams Jr., whose writings I edited in my press, and I put together a book of his shorter writings that you can find there. It's called Memory, Union, and Empire. And Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams, great grandson of John Adams, brother to Henry Adams, he was a member of the Anti-Imperialist League. He wrote some public letters to Roosevelt, was vice president in the League, an associate of Sumner, but then he drops out of the League. And his reasoning for that is very interesting. He becomes kind of a student of empire as such. And he's very interested in the benevolent ruling of exotic foreign locales by the British Empire in particular. So you might put him in the line of Hamilton, where he's consciously trying to imitate the successes of European empires. And Adams, he traveled around the world. He went to Central America. He went to the Sudan. He went to exotic lands and then wrote about imperial policy there. And you might say he was taking Kipling's poem very seriously, in that he was trying to imitate successful imperial governance. But he finally took exception to the Anti-Imperialist League, and his reasoning for it was very interesting. He said, okay, well, there are possessions now. Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and he believed they were incapable of governing themselves. They were going to have some imperial ruler. If we withdrew, now that Spain has been expelled, we were inviting the conquest of another power, probably hostile to our interests. And can we accept that own slight internationally? It was a very practical sort of argument that he had. It was not an ideological one. It was not his preference at the time, but he saw it as a fait accompli. Okay, we have these possessions. It's rather like looking at Biden's occupation of Afghanistan. Biden was not resolved to stay, but can't we extract ourselves from this unfortunate legacy of Afghanistan in some less discrediting way than Biden managed? Yes, certainly there was some other way that would have been better than that. And that was kind of like what Adams was saying in relation to the imperial policy. Wasn't looking for extraction from those places, but was making plausible arguments for the continued occupation. An interesting place to be. Before I forget, I wanted to make reference to something that we passed a little while ago. We were talking about the financial results of 98 and the ascendancy of the American imperial position. And we should remember the financial crisis of the years leading right up to the war. So you see there Grover Cleveland's second term, and you see major labor strife. You see a lot of strikes and such back in 1894. In 1896, there is a serious financial crisis. This is one of those occasions where J.P. Morgan and other American tycoons, they come together and form a syndicate to make sure that the government debt is serviced, that New York City doesn't go bankrupt, that the American financial system isn't taken over by hostile foreign syndicates that are gunning for us at the time. And the United States Treasury has a very touchy time. Now, we could possibly blame the Republican administration for some of that and some of their very ambitious tariff measures right in between Cleveland's administrations. And Cleveland kind of has to clean up the mess from some of that stuff. But nevertheless, with McKinley, we see a balanced budget. We see a reassured financial system. We see international demand for US Treasury bonds. We see an American economy ascendant. We see a very different kind of placement for the US government in relation to other financial and world powers. And this is something that the Republicans are talking about a lot going up to McKinley's reelection bid. And he does win resoundingly against William Jennings Bryan. And one of McKinley's great boosters in that election is Albert Beveridge. Albert Beveridge is a Republican from Indiana, and he makes speeches on behalf of William McKinley, his fellow Republican. And these are very effusive and enthusiastic speeches. And from this, we see some of the rhetoric of the time that is pitching a special divine destiny of American empire. Beveridge is quite effusive. Now, this you should know. Beveridge is a very serious guy. He is a major American historian. He's better remembered as the biographer of John Marshall these days than he is his political career. Beveridge says in his speeches praising McKinley that Americans are God's chosen people. He says on another occasion, fate has made our policy for us. The trade of the world must and shall be ours. He says that America is so productive and wealthy. It is our destiny to feed and clothe the world. That's a direct quote from this speech in praise of McKinley and in support of his reelection. That's what America is for. We're here to organize the world. What does he say? God has made us the master organizers of the world to overwhelm the forces of reaction throughout the earth. So we see in people like Albert Beveridge this very romantic notion, which Beveridge traces to the first Republican, Abraham Lincoln. And he also traces it back to Alexander Hamilton, who he directly credits as his inspiration, that the political class will organize the American economy for common prosperity. Beveridge is specifically referencing the crises in the Cleveland administrations. He's blaming the Democrats. He's blaming the anti-tariff Southerners back at the time of the Civil War. He is crediting Alexander Hamilton in his far-sighted vision of a kind of imperial structure for America, imperial ambitions for America. He's blessing Abraham Lincoln, saying Abraham Lincoln has this divine inspiration to form a more powerful central government for the country and to stamp out reactionary forces in the South. And he says that America will be a greater England with a nobler destiny. We will be the propagandists, not the misers of liberty. He also makes an allusion to something that Woodrow Wilson later picks up. He says the Spanish-American War is the first step in what he calls, quote, a war for permanent peace. The American ascent in global affairs, that will be the organization that ends conflict. This is a messianic purpose Beveridge is pitching. And it's really stunning stuff. The kinds of things that he's contending are the purpose of America, the destiny of America. It's a very high purpose, and we are all going to enjoy it because we are going to have this credit that is so very important all around the world. Everyone's going to be buying our bonds, according to Beveridge.
I would comment on that, but I'm afraid I can't do justice except to say he is certainly correct that the rest of the world is buying our bonds. We do direct world trade now. We do, I suppose, just in the pure sense of an economic and political power worldwide, I suppose we did surpass England, but I do question, and then I suppose this might have been perhaps the undertone of a lot of what you were reading, if this did actually benefit us, despite the fact that this was all originally based on the idea that if we don't have it, someone hostile will. But it does seem like that if we do have it, it doesn't really help us either. Charlie, it looked like you were wanting to say something.
Yeah, well, that that really tied some of the things I was commenting on earlier before about relating this period to the 20th century, because that everything that Bagby just always the same rhetoric with this type of imperialists, particularly American imperialists, where this system will exist that, you know, brings peace to the entire world through the domination of our system. And this, even the part about this war, the war with Spain being the war that will bring peace to the world. I mean, how many times have we heard this stuff? I was watching a movie the other day from 1936 that sort of laid out the post-war settlement, the post-war world order that was to be created, where, you know, national sovereignty would be eradicated in favor of this, you know, United Nations type institution that would control the whole world for the sake of progress and all this. It's the exact same type of rhetoric. So when you sort of hear those things that Beveridge is laying out right at the time, what everything right there is exactly what people complain about, which is an understatement in terms of how America acted on the so-called world stage of the 20th century. So in my mind, how can one sort of talk about this era of American imperialism as being based and cool and good for America when it's clearly it's the same thing. It's literally the same thing as what America did in the 20th century, but for some reason the pre-World War One, the 19th century American imperialism, we're supposed to think this is like good somehow, because these wars were, I don't know why were they good. This is sort of a sentiment that you get among people these days, I find, but I can't see how to square those those two things. How can you view the American imperialism at this time as good when it's clearly the exact same type of imperialism in the 20th century that we all hate?
Yes, and that's a very good point, and one that I really hope that the audience is taking into mind here. That as we read both through the anti-imperialist and as our great panelist Mr. Bagby brings out the pro-imperialist side, there a lot of these arguments, and I will grant that Charles Francis Adams Jr. Provides a much more pragmatic and I think the most defensible argument. However, I must say that even then, I have heard a lot of what he has said applied to our very extended stays elsewhere. However, with that in mind, I think it might be worth mentioning, just so as not to give the audience a false impression, the occupation of the Philippines did terminate at the time in which we decided that it would terminate. That was something that we held promise to. The Second World War meant that we amended it and had a much greater stake in the chain of islands than we perhaps originally intended when we said that we would withdraw in '46. But at the very least in the Philippines, that was a project that ended at a specific date, at least mostly. In the interest of continuing though, because we are running out of time, and I think that we're almost through the very high points of this speech. There was another one that I really wanted to highlight here, and this is once again just because it also sounds like it could be written today, where Sumner is going to talk about the interests that emerge from an empire naturally. And he says, "The doctrine that we are to take away from other nations any possessions of theirs which we think we could manage better than they are managing them, or that we are to take in hand any countries which we do not think capable of self-government, is one which will lead us very far. With that doctrine in the background, our politicians will have no trouble to find a war ready for us the next time that they come round to the point where they think that it is time for us to have another. We are told that we must have a big army hereafter. What for, unless we propose to do again by and by what we have just done? In that ease, our neighbors have reason to ask themselves whom we will attack next. They must begin to arm too, and by our act, the whole Western world is plunged into the distress under which the Eastern world is groaning. Here is another point in regard to which the conservative elements in the country are making a great mistake to allow all this militarism and imperialism to go on without protest. It will be established as a rule that, whenever political ascendancy is threatened, it can be established again by a little war, filling the minds of the people with glory and diverting their attention from our own interests. Hard-headed old Benjamin Franklin hit the point when, referring back to the days of Marlborough, he talked about the pest of glory. The thirst for glory is an epidemic which robs a people of their judgment, seduces their vanity, cheats them of their interests, and corrupts their consciences." I don't think I need to comment much on that. This is, I think this has entirely been borne out. The world is certainly much more deadly than it was before the Spanish-American War. And there are other factors, yes, that led to that, certainly, but I can't help but think that this addition of a self-consciously imperial power might have aggravated it. And then I also can't help but notice that the rest of his predictions are correct. We do find wars. In fact, this was the whole point of the stream on Buchanan's article, Pat Buchanan's article, "Whose War?" that we did on this series a few weeks ago, where the day or the week or the month after 9/11, the foreign policy analyst class, mostly neocons, with the interests of a non-American country in mind, already had drafted up multiple plans for invasions of countries that were completely uninvolved in the attack to begin with. They had these war plans devised up, plans for occupation, successions of wars, ready for us to go. And as Sumner points out, this is why they could do this. Why could they get away with it? Why was it even possible to begin with? And it's because long ago we decided that we were going to have available for us at any time the means which we would need to do these things. So this is why I wanted to bring up this paragraph. Do either of you have comment?
I kind of
Go
feel
ahead.
like that. I kind of feel like that is a good ending point almost for the stream.
I would like to suggest one last thought on this matter. We've talked about the responsible American population, the older model of the population that actually lived on the land, that actually owned the country that they claimed, as opposed to the majority today that exists as employees that seldom own what they live in, what they work with, even what they drive. And living the lives of quiet desperation, as Henry David Thoreau had it. We aren't as invested in the employment system, in the joint stock corporation, and so on. The very nature of the system, the perpetual indebtedness of the whole system, money as debt, which seems to be how it works these days. The thought of the country choosing a general trade embargo, as Jefferson did, to keep us out of war with Europe. Jefferson was saying, well, we don't need the international trade. The vast majority of us are farmers, like probably over 90% of Americans at that time. And we didn't need international trade. Now, he wrecked real legitimate interests by doing that. Shipping, merchants, manufacturers, and such. Those were real interests. They had legitimate concern, and they were outraged by Jefferson's embargo, to say nothing of the legal boundaries about it. But that's outside the point. The point is the thought of a country that could do that as a policy is unthinkable to us. That world is so unimaginable to us. But that was a world of real owners. That was a world of citizens who all had major stakes in the country. And they had everything that was necessary to live. They didn't need trade. They didn't need money because they got everything they needed from their farms. And that is so far from where we are now. It's even significantly far from the people of 1898, which is why they were dreaming of imperial glory and why it was popular. It was a temptation. And our succumbing to that temptation is part of our story, to that transition to the Hamiltonian system that we live in now. Hamiltonian nightmare, you might say, where very few own anything. Even Hamilton imagined that there would still be a significant class of farmers. But this is the kind of thing that the agrarians, the Vanderbilt agrarians, wrote about why they preferred agriculture to be the predominant activity in the community they preferred, as opposed to industrialism. It does lead to political consequences such as these, what we've been analyzing here in this show today.
Just to completely build on that point and let Sumner have the last word with this very Jeffersonian idea of self-sufficiency. I think that I had one more paragraph that I had highlighted that I think would be particularly good to end on after that, where Sumner says, "Now what will hasten the day when our present advantages will wear out, and when we shall come down to the conditions of the older and densely populated nations? The answer is war, debt, taxation, diplomacy, a grand governmental system, pomp, glory, a big army and navy, lavish expenditures, political jobbery, in a word, imperialism. In the old days, the democratic masses of this country, who knew little about our modern doctrines of social philosophy, had a sound instinct on these matters, and it is no small ground of political disquietude to see it decline. They resisted every appeal to their vanity in the way of pomp and glory, which they knew must be paid for. They dreaded a public debt and a standing army. They were narrow-minded and went too far with these notions, but they were at least right if they wanted to strengthen their democracy. So with that, with Sumner getting the last word, I think that we can move on to our super chats. I feel like this is all easily extrapolatable by our audience. Charlie, do you have the a collection of the super chats?
Yes, we have Dawn Browning, of course, sending us 20 Australian dollars in the form of let's see, an anthropomorphic lemon sort of waving its arms, and flowers behind it bloom and hearts fly out. So that's very cool. I like lemons, especially friendly ones. Thank you, Dawn Browning.
Yes, thank
and then
you
we've
very
got
much.
Corbin 9906 for $20. Just says Bagby. Indeed, Bagby. So thanks to both of you for supporting the show. That's all the super chats. Excuse me. Yeah, so hopefully this stream people thinking about America's development into its role as imperial overlord of the world in a different way, and or at least re-examining where they think that came from, because it certainly didn't simply come from Franklin Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson, as we have shown today. I'll just go ahead and read one more sentence from the essay. Quote, "That is the great fundamental cause of what I have tried to show throughout this lecture, that we cannot govern dependencies consistently with our political system, and that if we try it, the state which our fathers founded will suffer a reaction which will transform it into another empire just after the fashion of all the old ones. That is what imperialism means." So indeed, that is where we are now. We are at the point where America has transformed into another empire, just like all the old ones. Where we go from here is a question for us and for our descendants, and hopefully we can right the ship. I think we probably share a similar view here on many things that would need to happen in order to turn this degenerate empire, as the stream's title card says, into a one that is productive for the people, the nation, the American nation, and not the elites who sit on top of this thing, and more today, actual foreigners are the ones who are benefiting from this structure. So, does anyone have anything to say in closing?
I think everything I would want to say has been said already.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mr. George Bagby, for joining us fairly late today, but I'm glad we were able to actually do this.
I'm very glad to be with you, gentlemen. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and thank you for being here. It greatly elevated the quality of the stream. And in my opinion, and I'm not usually so self-promoting, and so I really do mean this, I feel like we do a good, at least academic job. So that you greatly elevate it definitely says something. So yes, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So we'll see you all next week for a continuation of our series on the Monroe Doctrine. So tune in for episode 21.
Actually,
yes.
I'm pretty sure that. Oh no, never mind. It is Washington's farewell address. Sorry, I had the wrong day.
Yes. So Washington's farewell address next week, back at the usual time, which is